Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. For some of you, good night. Wherever you are, welcome to Innov8rs Connect and welcome to today's session about creation leadership. The most pervasive emotion in today's world of work is fear. Fear of the future, fear of missing targets, fear of becoming redundant in an environment of financial optimization and automation. Not surprisingly, engagement and return on payroll are pitiful, and innovation is mostly a pipe dream or theater at best. In this session, we will explore a different reality, one that anyone can begin to create no matter what job title or mandate one may hold, a reality of meaningful outcomes, authentic relationships, and of joyful creation. Our speaker for today, Philip Horvath, has always explored the edges of culture, working with artists, entrepreneurs, activists, and corporate changemakers. He inspires through transformational storytelling and guides processes towards creating new cultural operating systems. As a co-founder of Lumen, he serves as a strategist for organic organizational transformation and as a cultural catalyst and entrepreneurship trainer, focusing on connecting employees to their purpose and providing psychological safety to create transformational results. Before we start, first I want to do a quick shout out to our partners for making this virtual summit possible. So thanks to Planbox, IDSkill, Board of Innovation, Alpha, Mural, and Chromatic for supporting this. And I would like you to know that there's a chat box and a Q&A box in this webinar tool. For most, it's in the bottom of your screen. For some, it might be in one of the corners. Just post your question, comment in either of these boxes, and I will then feed them to Philip for him to address. With that being said, Philip, welcome. Let's get started.
Thank you so much, Hans. I really appreciate it. And thank you so much for everybody being here, whatever time it might be in your world. We live in international internet time now, so I really appreciate that you're here and to talk about a new way of working. As Hans said, my focus is really on three things with Lumen and also my own work on future, culture, and leadership. And it's really rooted in the idea that a new way of working is indeed possible, that we can have meaningful outcomes, we can have authentic relationships, and we can actually all be engaged in joyful creation. And I don't just think that's possible, I actually think it's necessary. And I would go so far as to say it's a matter of life and death, both personal as well as it is from a business perspective. But let's take a look into the future and see what we see there that makes me think that. The future is already here. Right? If you look around today in the world, many people already are living a life that others only a few years have only dreamt of. And it's happening right now. So it's not a matter of waiting or one day there'll be future. We're about to enter 2020. We've been talking a lot about 2030, and suddenly that's only 10 years away. And another thing, in terms of 10 years, about 42% today, as of December 2019 in the world, has smartphones, right? And I'm pretty sure that probably everybody on this call has a smartphone. But did you have one 5 years ago? Right? And most of you maybe still say, yes, sure. But did you have one 10 years ago? Right? That's only 10 years. So a lot has happened in 10 years. Well, some companies are still struggling to figure out whether they should have a mobile interface or an app for the phone for their business. This is already commonplace today. Right, and 42% of the population, and that includes countries like India and continents like Africa and South America, people have cell phones today, 10 years, only 10 years. So think about what happened in the next 10 years, right? In 10 years, we might not even have smartphones anymore, but then we might not have a screen that we look at, but we actually have it in our contact lenses, and there's multiple companies who already have patents to make that happen. So that can happen in only 10 years. So really, we're shifting into the future super fast these days. And if you have, still a company that worries about 5-year plans, forget them. Because 5 years, you really don't know what's happening. What you can do is you can focus on where you want to be in 10 years, and you can figure out what you can accomplish in the next 6 months. And we live in this world of VUCA. Some of you on the call, since you're all innovators, you probably have heard the term. But for those of you who haven't heard it, it's actually an old military term that came about for situations that were volatile, extremely uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And that's why we created special forces. Well, today, VUCA is kind of the norm. Right, it's a new normal. We have environmental chaos and global instability every day. We get news about some new weather event or some new political crisis, people getting on the streets around the world, deciding that their politics isn't working for them anymore. Right? And that's even like just a statistic this morning, over 60% in Germany think that politics isn't working anymore. Right? This is very, very scary. And we have, of course, technological exponential changes that are changing things every day and will make about 80% of current jobs redundant very soon. And that's actually kind of okay because most of those jobs are crap, right? And we'll have completely new jobs. But there's a lot of change happening here. And the result is that there's a tremendous amount of mental stress, anxiety, and overwhelm in our society, and an awareness that we actually really all lack future skills. We're not really prepared for this future. And it's not just change, it's a transformation, right? And we like to make that distinction, but change happens all the time, right? And it's continuous. It goes from A to B to C to D, and you're kind of constantly improving or changing something, but it's continuous. It's something that we can actually process. Transformation is different. Transformation is when you actually have to cease to exist in point A so it can pop up in point D. And in between, maybe you have no idea what's going on, right? It might be complete darkness, it might be complete overwhelm, it might be complete not knowing what's happening. And it's a discrete jump, right? Where you can create something completely new. But we have to be willing to go through this in-between experience. And this in-between experience of transformation feels like death, right? Or at least it feels like death to parts of your brain. If you think about our brain, we have a reptilian brain, a brain stem that corresponds with, bodily functions. And then we have this limbic system, it's our emotional system. And there's this one part called the amygdala. And the job of the amygdala is to constantly scan for potential threats, right? Or even starting with symmetry, perceiving symmetry, because the only things in nature that are symmetrical are food, foe, or a friend, right? And so we're actually trained to look out for symmetry. And today we have things that are triggering our amygdala all day long. Environments that we're in, street noise, people around us, even down to the little shiny, notifications on your phone that are actually meant to trigger your amygdala response so that you go back to Facebook, you go back to LinkedIn, you go back to Twitter to check out what's been happening and if someone liked your post, right? So we're constantly getting this amygdala firing. And then the amygdala fires, what happens is that it kicks in your sympathetic nervous system, right? And it releases about 1,400 chemicals into your system that trigger a fight, flight, freeze, or friend response. Right? And we see this everywhere. We see it in politics. We see it in corporations. In terms of fighting, fortunately, for the most part, we don't actually kill each other anymore. We or hit each other or sling shit at each other like monkeys do. We point fingers, right? We blame people, right? So there's a lot of blaming going on. As I said, in politics, in corporations, you're trying to not be the one that things get stuck with, right? And there's a lot of flight, right? There's a lot of escaping going on. Alcohol and drugs are rampant. And when I talk about drugs, I'm not talking about a lot of weed or something like that. I'm talking about actually psychopharmaceuticals, the rise of which is insane. In America alone, the rise of benzos has gone up in the last decade over 70%. Right? So there's a lot of people popping pills to deal with their anxiety. Right? And of course, there's also people who just delude themselves and think that, hey, if I just stand still, I'm just going to do my job, I'm just going to be a good little employee, things are going to be okay somehow, right? And that's also not true because nobody's coming to save you, right? And then there's finally commiserating, which just means whether you do it around the water cooler or in some online chat room or even maybe on the streets, finding others that you can complain with about what's going on, right? And these all are natural responses of a sympathetic nervous system. Right, so as soon as that gets triggered, blood goes into arms and legs to prepare for fighting and running. Our heart rate slows down, our respiration slows down. There's all kinds of physical symptoms that actually kill you, right? Until you get to the point where your parasympathetic nervous system kicks in. Your parasympathetic nervous system is the one that says, relax, right? And you can do it, for example, by breathing, right? Taking a deep breath. When you do that, 1,200 other chemicals get released into your system. And those help you with all kinds of other functions like growing and evolving and digesting and healing. And this is actually where we want to be, right? We want to be able to trigger our parasympathetic nervous system because that's what makes us feel alive, right? And I talked about life and death, and this is really a story of life, right? And if you think about life, one of the very simple things is that all life is a value creation system. Right? From a single cell to a plant to an animal to humans to the things we build as humans like businesses and governments and all these things, they're all meant to be value creation systems. And what does it mean to have a value creation system? It really means that it has metabolism. Right? It's one of the first things we check for to see if something's alive. Well, it just means something goes in, something goes on, something comes out. And there's some sort of feedback loop around it. Right? And as I said, this is true for individual cells. as much as it is for humans, right? We have an input, we take things in from food to emotions to information to people to inspirations. We have things that are coming in, we have things we are processing, right? And we have the things that we're creating. And especially in the last century, we've essentially told people that life is about maximizing your input. There's a great movie called Century of Self by Adam Curtis, a BBC correspondent, who put together this whole movie on Edward Bernays and propaganda and the rise of Madison Avenue and marketing. Right? And really, what we keep hearing if you turn on the TV, and especially recently with all the Black Fridays and Christmas and all that stuff going on, it's about maximizing your input. More, more, more. Supersize me, right? Get more, get more, get more. Consume more. When you consume, you're actually killing it, right? It's gone. When you eat something, it's gone afterwards. And it depends on what you do with that energy now, right? And to be alive would actually be to focus on your output, to create more than you consume, right? But instead, we've been focusing on death. We've been focusing on consumption. So there's a big shift that needs to happen here around our individual definition of what life means, right? To actually come back to knowing that the greatest joy, the most amazing drug is creativity, creating value for someone else, right? And the same thing goes with our businesses, right? They too have inputs, processes, and outputs. And here we've essentially, in our quest to maximize shareholder value, have created our processes such that they're both screwing inputs and outputs. Right? On the input side, we've externalized costs to sometimes weakest and most vulnerable communities that are around. Right? We've tried to skim on how we're going to get stuff that we're going to make, right? So we're really looking at how can I, get the cheapest materials, go in a country where nobody cares about other mental regulations, poison other people's rivers as long as they're far away, right? So we've eroded inputs and we've eroded outputs as well. There's a study by McKinsey that showed that if you purely look at financial metrics, the quality of your product or service erodes, right? And in this world of planned obsolescence where we want you to buy the next part next year, next year, next year, our outputs have actually also diminished in value, right? And as I said, it's a matter of life and death. Every business is social, right? If you're creating more, if you're extracting value both from the input and the output side, right? Ultimately, you're screwing everybody, right? And every business is social, whether you feed a community and make them prosperous and create an environmental balance and build communities, or whether you extract resources, leave things behind broken and abuse people, you have a social effect, right? So we need to really shift our businesses and start focusing again on actually creating meaningful outcomes. Right? And that starts with you, and it doesn't matter what position you have in the organization. You might think, who am I to change how we're doing things around here? Well, if you don't, nobody will, right? And even in your department, in your team, in the processes that you're in charge of, you can start looking at how can I make this meaningful? How can I create something here that is of actual value to people out there? And that requires a slightly different culture. And the reason we start with, purpose here is because purpose ultimately allows you to bear anyhow. Right? This is a quote by Viktor Frankl. If you don't know him, he is a psychologist who actually survived a concentration camp, and quoted Nietzsche here in that he said that he who has a why can bear almost anyhow. Right? And that's why we start with purpose. Why are you doing what you're doing? Right? And it's not, some, hey, save the world, kumbaya, happy, happy stuff. It's really just very practical. Why are you doing what you're doing? And purpose is a mixture of meaning and impact. Right? Meaning is your own personal why. The word meaning actually comes from German meinen, which means to make mine. Right? So purpose is a combination of something that you hold for yourself, that's valuable to you, that's important to you, and the impact you create out in the world. Some bigger picture. Right? Because if you don't have something bigger than yourself, you have no reason to grow. Right? You need to orient yourself in something beyond yourself so that you can stretch yourself and grow further. And if you have clear purpose, that's a source of direction, obviously. Right? That's also helping with intrinsic motivation, right? Because the definition of intrinsic motivation is that you have a personal why, you have a personal vision of who you could become, and you have a vision of something outside in the world that exists because of what you do. Right? And if you take those two things, that gives you a reason to get up in the morning and do things, no matter if you get paid for it or not, right? Because you believe in what you do. And it's going to give you the energy you need to get up in the morning and allow you to continue to grow and even to bring in others and inspire others, whether they are customers, teammates, people in the department, your boss, right? It allows for aligned autonomous action. It allows for others to participate, right? And really create value, right? And this is another thing in terms of outcome orientation. A lot of us are doing our job because it's our job, but we're not really clear about the value we're creating, right? 80% of the people who work inside of an organization actually work for someone else inside of the organization. They don't actually create customer value. And so to understand that even someone inside of the organization is also your customer, and that whatever you do, it's about creating real, tangible value. You know you've created something, not when you fulfilled your job, but when someone else's life is actually better. Right? And talking about other people, in today's world where we have such big problems, we actually need as many diverse perspectives as we can get. Where diversity and inclusion is more and more in the media, which is awesome, but it's still coming from this point of, oh, we need to tolerate that. It's not that we need to tolerate it and welcome it, we need to actually encourage it, right? Because none of us can really see reality, and in such a complex world, an ambiguous world, and an uncertain world where things change quickly, we need to actually make sure that we get as many perspectives in the room as possible, right? And to integrate them, of course, we need clear agreements, right? We need support structures that allow us to know who's doing what by when and how we know that it's done. And we also need ways of dealing with broken agreements, right? Because depending on how you handle that, it can either increase shame or it can increase trust, right? And so we need tools to actually deal with that and figure out how can we create containers where it's really clear what people are doing. And that's the next thing, is to be really clear on who we are. In a world of cover your ass and just do your job, ambiguity is actually kind of helpful, right? Because you're trying to not be too transparent. But today we live in a world of transparency, right? Where we can see things, where we can know things that we didn't know before, right? Today, a consumer has more power than ever before. Back in the day, your purpose as a company could be to just make money, and you have a really toxic culture as a result of it. And your brand was a whole different thing that was being dealt with by the marketing department, right? But today, that becomes transparent, right? If your purpose is only to make money and you have a toxic culture and your product is crap, people will actually put that out there. And take Volkswagen as an example. The brand got tarnished by actually highlighting that the culture was toxic and really focused on profits, why they allowed themselves to make such stupid mistakes as to actually cheat the government and cheat the consumer and cheat the person who actually they should be doing things for. So having clarity, being really aware of what is it we're doing. And both of those things, clear agreement structures and clarity, actually increase psychological safety. Right? I chose the picture of cocoon here because if you think about transformational processes, right, this caterpillar, before it becomes a butterfly, has to be allowed to turn into mush. Right? It completely dissolves. And for that, it needs a container that holds them. Right? And that's what we can do, is to create containers for people to feel safe, to feel like they can be themselves at work. And Google, talked about how that's one of the primary factors for high-performing teams, that people can be themselves and be themselves all the way, right? We tend to think of ourselves as these rational beings, but 80% of our decisions are emotional and physical, right, in our somatic system. And so when we go to work, most people check their personality at the door. Deloitte just put a study out that, said that over 60% are engaging in covering, right, actively hiding who they are to be okay with being an employee and to do their job. So that doesn't work, right? It makes people sick. It makes us sick. I mean, the absenteeism, presenteeism, and health issues of that are rampant. And what we really want as humans is authentic relationships, right? We want to be ourselves, and we want to be able to be with others being themselves and have tools to relate to each other. Right? And you can start this. Right, coming back to, culture is one of those things that big consulting companies get lots of money for to try and change, and they put a bunch of plaques on the wall around how you're people company and you have these core values, and nothing happens, right? Because culture is really an emergent phenomenon. If you think of yourself as sort of a drop that falls into water and makes rings, and everybody in your company does that, culture is what happens in that interference pattern, right? It's an emergent phenomenon. And if you start showing up differently at work, guess what? Your work environment will change. You might have seen the opposite way, where you had a really well-functioning team and you have a new teammate who's kind of toxic, and next thing you know, the culture of the team goes to shit. Right? But that can also happen in the positive. If you start showing up differently at work and you insist on being yourself and you insist on being authentic, right, you will actually impact the environment that you work in. And that goes to the last part here, which is leadership, right? To really think about what does it mean to be a human. And my futurist colleague John Nesbitt talked about how the most exciting breakthroughs of the 21st century will not occur because of technology, but because of an expanded concept of what it means to be human. And as someone who's been dealing with this topic for a long time, it's actually been really encouraging to see that in the last couple of years of talking about AI and the robots coming and all that stuff, suddenly there's been a shift over the last couple of years where people are realizing it's people, right? In the end, it's about humans. And it's about humans stepping into leadership. And when I say leadership, again, this is not a title or a mandate. This is really a choice, right? And it's a choice for yourself, and it's a continuous process. We talked about input, process, output earlier, and that idea of life, right? And input, maybe look at awareness, responsibility, and ownership, right? My inputs are what I'm becoming aware of, what I'm learning. And if I choose to take agency for them, if I choose to step into responsibility, and I do that in an accountable, regular way, ultimately I'll be in ownership, right? And awareness is about your mindset, about who you be, right? How are you showing up? How are you looking at yourself? What's concerning you, right? What do you think you can create in this world, right? And as you do that, it affects your behaviors, right? Who you can become every day, and ultimately, the outcomes you create, right? And through these outcomes you create for others, the value that you create for others, you create that sense of belonging that we all look for. And it's a process, right? It keeps going, you keep growing, you keep learning. There's no right way of being you. Nobody's actually ever been you. So how could there be possibly a right way to be you, right? The only job you have is to continue to raise your awareness, to continue to expand, learn more, see more, perceive more, open yourself up to the world around you, and see what is there for you. What is it for you to take responsibility for? Not all of us can do everything. Like my friend likes to say, I'm not the guy who straps himself to a pontoon boat in the harbor to, fight for Greenpeace. That might not be your thing, right? Look around you, look in your own immediate environment, your family, your friends, your community, your job, your team, right? What can you do there, right? And how can you start new behaviors? How can you adopt new habits that ultimately will create more meaningful outcomes for you? And there's a couple of key capacities that we think are necessary for that and really for the future of work. The first is self-reliance, and I've kind of talked about that a little bit already in the sense that if it's to be, it's up to me. Right? You can wait for some president next year or some new, boss and the CEO, some new head of culture, some new head of innovation, some new boss manager, some new job, whatever. It's not going to do it for you. Right? Nobody is saving you. Nobody's creating your world for you. It's ultimately absolutely up to you. Right? And you have to be clear on who you are, what you stand for, what your values are, what you're working towards, the purpose that inspires you, and work from there. And it's unique to you. As I said, nobody's been you before. Your whole point, your primary job is to be you. Right? Nobody knows how to do that job but you. Right? And as you bring that gift to the table, we can have that perspective. Like I said earlier, we need as many perspectives on the table. And even if you're the only one in your company who sees something a certain way, so be it. Be willing to stand up for yourself and express yourself, right? Because only then can we get real novel solutions. And that requires some level of self-management, which I'll talk about in a moment as well, but ultimately the ability to regulate your own system, from body to emotions to mind to relationships, to be able to regulate that so it actually helps you to be agile and adaptable as an individual, because only then will we get teams that are that, and only then will we get organizations that are that. Right? So it starts again with you. And ultimately even organizing something, understanding how to take an idea from a signal from a first order. It might be something, thinking about possibilities, having tools to test for feasibility, if it's even worth it, and ultimately take something all the way to launch. Right? Those are some of the key capacities that we see direly lacking in many organizations because people have been trained to be employees, right, and follow orders and react to other people's things. Right? They've told not to express themselves and be a good little employee and check their personality door. We've unfortunately nowhere in school or anywhere else have actually learned how to regulate our system. Right? Coming back down to even as simple as I mentioned earlier, to be aware of our amygdala and when they're triggers and to be able to take a deep breath and get out of that. Right? Those kind of simple tools to manage yourself. And self-organization is beginning to happen a little bit with design thinking and lean and all those tools that people are learning. But again, they don't make sense at all. You can literally burn your post-it notes and forget your design thinking sessions if the first three are not there, right? And that's why we see a lot of, and I see also a lot of disappointment around tools like design thinking, because people are realizing that something's missing. And I lived in California for many years, and I realized that some of these tools, were evolved in the context of California, and you can't just take the tool out of the place and try and do it somewhere else, right? Then you have something like cargo cult starting, and if you haven't heard of cargo cults, fun stuff to look up. It's really about mimicking certain activities without actually having the mindset and the real understanding behind doing them. Right? And so you need that personal component. It's the number one thing that I see why innovation fails, why organizational transformation fails, why digital transformation initiatives fail, leadership programs fail, because they're ultimately not going all the way to the individual. Right? We're terrified of being ourselves at work. And that's the key thing to change, because the future is ultimately in your hands. It's up to you to create the future. If you have children, if you want them to be as old as you are one day, we need to change some things here, right? And it starts with every single one of us. We can't wait for someone else to do it for us. And it's a matter of life and death, as I said earlier. And it's really also your life on the line, right? Why are you going to work every day? Right? One day you will be dead. One day, in all likelihood, we're working on life extension, but in all likelihood, one day you'll be dead. And what do you want on your gravestone? Do you want it just to say, hey, he was a good employee, he showed up at work every day? Or do you want to do something epic? Right? Do you want to do something, use your life, know that you are leaving something behind that is meaningful? And it's not easy to be an innovator. Anybody here on the call who does innovation, you know how hard it is, right? Because ultimately you have the entire immune system of the organization against you, right? And I'd like to do an experiment with people when I do workshops where I say, if you have a watch, put it on the other hand, right? And actually see how weird that feels and how out of place that feels and how you just want to rip your arm off because it feels so weird. And that's how an organization feels about you if you're an innovator, right? Because any deviation from the norm triggers the amygdala. Right? Coming back to that. So if you're coming into your boss's office and you're trying to bring them something new, the first thing that will happen is that the amygdala triggers. And if they don't know about that, if you don't know about that, next thing you know, you're in some, stupid fight with them around your idea and ultimately walk back defeated. So in this, if you're an innovator, please, know that anxiety is part of it, right? As I said, medication for anxiety has gone up 70%. We have over 40 million people in America who claim that they have anxiety regularly, and that's awesome in some ways, because anxiety is simply the understanding that who you are right now and what the situation requires are incongruent. Right? And there's two ways to go about it now. The one is that you can now beat yourself up for not being good enough, not being smart enough, not being rich enough, not being powerful enough, not being whatever enough to do something about the situation. And you go into this sort of death spiral of self-defeating thought. Or you ask yourself in that moment, wow, I'm feeling anxious. Who would I have to be not to feel anxious right now? And if you simply ask yourself that question, you actually become a little bit more of that person and you grow into more and more freedom. And one of the things that's really important for that is some routine of self-care. Right? It's really easy to forget in today's life. We're all busy. If you have kids, you're probably up in the morning, early, running around, making sure everybody gets fed, everybody gets put to school, everybody, going to the work, and you have 400 emails waiting for you, and your boss waiting for you, and 4 colleagues that want something. Take some time for self-care. Right? Take some time to take care of your body. Right? Think about what are you putting into your system and how is it supporting you, from food to regular hydration. Right? Water is super important for clear thinking. To some exercise, some movement that allows you to actually use this tool and not be distracted by it. Make sure you create environments for yourself of emotional safety, psychological safety, as I mentioned earlier. My colleague Margaret Whitley talks about creating oases of sanity, right, for yourself and others, where really, whether it's in a hotel room or at home, or however you can create that, but create times for yourself when you can let go, where you can relax, where you can just be yourself and you feel safe. Right? And you can do gratitude rituals. There's all kinds of tips and tricks around how you can create that for yourself that we teach in workshops. And of course, mind. Right? Mindfulness has become very popular. Actually, Headspace is one of the top apps downloaded by the millennial generation at the moment. And to some extent, that can be escapism. But on the other hand, really, it's about understanding how our mind works. Right? On average, we have about 12 to 60,000 thoughts per day, depending on what research you read. And the majority of them is self-defeating and repetitive. Right? We keep coming back to that same thought about how we could have said that, done that, or how we should do, or this could happen. Right? And none of those are real. Right? The only thing is what's real is right now in this moment. Everything else happens in your imagination. Yesterday only exists in your imagination. Tomorrow only exists in your imagination. So one thing you can do is to actually learn how to be aware of your mind and the thoughts that you're thinking. Right? And there's lots of really awesome tools out there to help you with that. And community, right? Really making sure that your family, your friends, your partner, your community, work community, that they're understanding what you're up to, who you are, and what you care about, and what you're passionate about, so that they can give you support. Right? If they don't know what's happening with you, how could they possibly support you? Right? And get yourself somebody that is actually just interested in you, whether it's a psychologist, a coach, or a guru, whatever you might need, somebody where you can go to and just, vomit out whatever is in your head and have someone that's there to support you around your own thought process. Right? Because while it is a one-player game, and I did talk about self-reliance earlier, none of us can do this alone. Right? We all need support. And to accept that we all need support is also something really important. I'm not talking about help because nobody wants to feel helpless, right? But we all need support. None of us can do this alone. So get yourself some support in your community as well. And make sure you take time to connect to yourself, right? Um, to take time where you actually go and spend time just with you, right? Where you take that morning, and if it's 5 minutes, if it's 10 minutes, if it's 15 minutes, it doesn't matter. Right? Not everybody can afford an hour or two of morning ritual. No, totally understand that. Well, it depends on your work situation. But even taking 5 minutes to just breathe and be by yourself already makes a gigantic difference. Right? Because instead of waking up in the morning triggered by an alarm clock running after everybody else's needs, you're spending some time in the morning to just center yourself and then go into your day. So instead of reactive, instead of following everybody else, you're actually choosing to move. Right? So spend some time to connect to yourself. And remember that you're here to be in joyful creation, right? Your job is really to be alive, right? And to feel that joy of what it means to have added value to someone else's life. And then moving in this whole age of a creator, right? We've gone from hunting and gathering to agriculture to industrialization to this weird optimization phase into this whole new phase, right? Where we now need people like you to be out there and create. So meaningful outcomes, authentic relationships, joyful creation. I think we can make that happen, and I think we can all make it to happen together. So thank you. And I saw we have a couple of questions that came in, so I want to make sure that I address those as well.
First of all, let me thank you, Philip, for sharing this important message, and maybe just let it sink in for a little bit before we dive into the Q&A, because it is fundamental to our work and to our life, basically. So thanks for sharing this message. Emily is asking, how do you know when to get out of a work situation? How do you know that you've done enough? Assuming you can probably never can do enough, but how do you know when to get out?
When to get out? Honestly, I think it's really up to you to understand where, like two things. One, I think, is understanding your boundaries, right? When you think about, for example, anger, and when you feel anger, that comes from a boundary violation, right? Somebody's crossed your boundaries. And when it happens continuously and you accumulate that anger, eventually you're actually going to get sick, right? Because anger is a poison that you drink hoping someone else will die, right? So if you constantly have these transgressions, then your first step is to say, okay, cool, go and try and negotiate those anew, because we can never really change other people. We can only change how they communicate with us and how they relate with us, right? Because we are all in our own little reality tunnel, and you never know what's going on with someone else, right? They might have, all kinds of problems in their world. So if you have a toxic environment and people are, not respecting you and you're not getting connections there, the first thing to do is, of course, see what you can renegotiate. And only if that fails, if you realize that people are actually not responding to you and that there's no change in their behavior at all, eventually find yourself something else. And I think there's really, there's so many things that need to get done today. And there's actually, in terms of the job market, if you have any sort of innovation skills, you're actually not looking so bad right now either. There are, because we need people that have new kinds of work skills. So prepare yourself for that next level and really think about, if you think about what a job means, right? If it's not an opportunity for you to do something meaningful, change it. Right? Because really, what's the point of you going to work every day to do a job that you don't like in a toxic environment, only so you can go home and watch some Netflix to make up for it? You know what I mean? That seems really, really horrible. You know what I mean? And I understand economic struggles, and understand, what it means to actually putting your life on the line, which is why I mentioned why self-care is so important. And we all struggle. We all want to know that we're okay and that we have, money to feed ourselves and our children and our families. But there's always another job. There's always something else you can do. And if you're failing to renegotiate, or if people are failing to show up for you to renegotiate your work relationships, right, and it's really not working, go find yourself something else. For me, actually, when I talk to people about jobs and when I do some career coaching, I usually talk about finding a way to get paid for something you want to learn. Right? Because even if you're doing something the same day every day, if it's not actually creating value for you or the world, again, what's the point? Right? So find a way where you can say, hey, I know this much and I would love to learn about this, and go find yourself a job in that realm. And I hope that answers your question.
I think it does. Harvey is, oh, it's not a question, but I wanted to thank you.
Mm.
It is important to build resilience and understand how you recover. So Philip, you shared, on that note, you shared already quite some practices. What I'm curious about, and I know you've also run programs and embedded it there, so how can you embed it in your team's practices?
Mm-hmm. Meaning that not for yourself, but for your team?
Well, for yourself and your team, yes.
Well, again, starts with yourself, obviously, right? That's the first step. And then, it's even like how you run meetings. I think, most of us who spend any time in the corporate world know that the worst brain and time and mind suck is meetings, right? So how you conduct those, for example. And it starts with, even finding out if the meeting is even necessary to begin with, right? And if you can find better ways and respecting other people's time. Because every time you have people in the room, if you think of them as sort of free agents rather than employees, that's a lot of money, right? If you had to pay them hourly for sitting there for a meeting and you had to pay them their hourly rates, you probably wouldn't have half of those meetings. But just because you're an employee, we take that for granted that they have time, so we invite them. So, right, so to start with, be clear about what meetings you really need with your team, right? To be clear with your team also what priorities are there, right? It goes all the way to bringing your team water, right? And making sure that, a real leader doesn't just make sure that they're hydrated, but they also make sure that their team is hydrated, right? And creating, as I said earlier, I love that phrase from Margaret Wheatley around creating oases of sanity, right? One thing you can do is to be clear with your team that whatever environment you're in, you might not believe in either. And you might say, hey, how our company runs sucks. And around us, the culture is toxic and horrible. What can we do as a team, right? Coming back to enroll them in a shared purpose and bring them back to meaningful outcomes, and coach them to allow them to say, what can they individually do to create a different environment, right? And so to really take all those things, again, always starting with yourselves. And we have this, think about these ripples, right? I love this image that originally Covey actually came up with this idea of sphere, he called it circles of concern and influence and control. We kind of changed it to spheres of concern and influence, because sphere is more multidimensional than a circle, and we do live in multidimensional times now. And we dropped control because we can't really control anything. We can increase likelihoods or probabilities for something to happen, but control, I think, is a bit of an outdated world and idea in a world where we realize that there's so many factors that are influencing things. So when you think about yourself, then the next step out would be I and I, right? You in relationship to a person in front of you. The next level out is sort of your team, the size of your hunter-gatherer group, your family, right? And then teams of teams, as in departments and organizations, ultimately to teams of teams of teams and ecosystems all the way to the planet. So understanding that you are creating these ripples and how you show up with your team and also how you enable your team to show up, right, will then create further ripples into your organization, and into the world. Right? So really understanding that each of your team members is an individual with needs, spending time with them, understanding where they're coming from, and creating the most pleasant and safe environment for them to perform.
Ron is asking, how do you change mindset? Quite a broad question, but I guess you have several answers to that.
Well, it's it's a lifetime obsession of mine. I think in general, through exposure to new ideas, right? I think it's already exposure. I think is a big one, right? And if you think about a traditional transformation process, right, you have that first part of defreezing, then you insert some new ideas, and then you refreeze, right? And so what we do, for example, think back to the last book that you read that totally shook you, or the last movie that you saw, or the last art piece you saw, the last piece of music or song you heard, right? I always say when you've encountered art, you changed how you look at the world, and you can't look at the world the same way afterwards, right? And so really to create transformational experiences is an art as it is, and to change mindset, oftentimes these things are really, really deep rooted, right? If you think about even 80% of behavior, I said earlier, is not necessarily rational, it's actually somatic, right? It's actually in our bodies and in our emotional makeup. And it's stuff that is actually pre-verbal. That's not stuff that we can necessarily even vocalize or put into words, right? Because we've learned it from copying mother, father, preacher, teacher, right? When we grew up, and we just copied them, right? And sometimes we're completely unaware. Like, for example, one of the teachers I like, she was talking about how she's a really, really lovely woman, talks about kindness all the time, super sweet person. And she was giving this example of how she got in the car to drive with someone somewhere. And as soon as she got in the car, she turned into this road rage maniac, like honking and yelling at people and, using curse words. And the person next to her was completely flabbergasted. And I looked at her and said, dude, do you know what's happening here? Do you realize how you're showing up? And she said, wait, this is how you drive, no? But she learned that from her dad, who drove like that. And until that moment, until it became conscious to her, she never even thought about it. She thought that's just how you drive. And it completely separated from her other reality. Right? Well, I've seen that in California a lot when I worked with a lot of consciousness people, and they're the sweetest person, and they're all about oneness and all that good stuff. And then they get in the car and they cut you off in traffic right after, right? And it's because it's different aspects of ourselves. So mindset, I think, first is to create a safe space to transform. Right? Coming back to that cocoon, you can't expect someone to change their mind, right? Because to change the transformation in that sense is a death experience, and you will have all the ego defenses that come with it. Right? If you try to sell innovation to someone, you know what I'm talking about, right? You're going to get all the ego defenses to something that's new and different, right? And especially in Germany, they love to say like, "Oh, that'll never work," right? As a first response, right? So you have to create a space where it's even possible for them to transform, right? And then invite them into that new way of thinking, and really starting with a vision for themselves of who they can be. Right? The only reason people transform, and there's an article I've wrote on Medium about that, if you think about transformation, that needs a pull, right? And that pull only happens from two factors that I've seen so far. One is dread, and one is aspiration, right? Dread is when my current situation is not acceptable anymore, right? Where the current situation is actually shameful and painful and totally unacceptable. That's when I'm willing to transform, right? Or I'm doing it because I have an aspiration, right? Because I have a new vision of myself, of who I could become, right? That pulls me into that direction. And sometimes you need to dread before you can get to aspiration, right? Because a lot of us actually, especially in our societies, we've been taught to worry, but we've not taught to imagine and vision ourselves, right? It's incredibly hard, stupidly enough. We're all imagination machines. And if I asked you how many things could go wrong in the next day, you could come up with 1,000 things. Right? If I asked you, like, what's a positive vision of what's the best thing that could happen today, we're going to struggle, right, for a moment, because you're not trained to imagine positively, right? So sometimes in order to change mindset, you have to defreeze people and maybe even be a bit radical. And I like to, David Bowie had on set that say something straight because you save yourself time, right? Even if it's unpleasant, but to not shy away from conflict either. right? Because I think it's unrealistic to think that we're going to live in a world ever without conflict. We just can learn how to manage it in ever better ways.
Follow-up question by Ron. How do you increase consciousness so a person is more aware of deliberate decision-making versus a pre-programmed response?
Again, I think safe space and mirroring, right? Actually reflecting back, right? If you have, for example, someone who's shown up in a really painful way, right, or in some toxic way, to actually spend the time with them, create a container where both of you feel safe to share, and let them know that this is your observation, right? And not in an accusing way, not in a you suck and you're an asshole and you show up in meetings and it sucks, but instead that saying, hey, have you noticed that when you do this, people feel that way, or I feel that way, right? To make it really personal and be an ownership, right? To say, hey, when you behave in a certain way, this is the effect it has on people, right? I think that's one thing that we don't really realize, that every, come back to the output we generate, everything we generate has a cost for people, right? So if I'm being an asshole, or I'm showing up in a meeting in a really unpleasant way, that has a tremendous cost on everybody's presence and performance in the end, right? And so I think to even make people aware of that, again, make sure the container is appropriate and available for feedback, right? Because it doesn't, it's not a good time to come to your boss and ask them for a raise if he's in the middle of just, yelling at someone else, right? So to actually create a moment where there is a safe space for reflection, ask if they're available for feedback, and then if they're available for feedback, to share it with them in the most neutral way that you can, to help them make it not about you and what you need, but really make it about compassion for them, and to understand that behaving in a certain way is obviously not serving them, right? So you're actually giving them the gift of feedback to let them know that that's not working, right? So that they can improve, but to not do it from a judgmental way, not do it from a needy way where you need your, justification and you need to be heard, but to really come from a place of love and care for them, right? Because it really doesn't do anybody any good. And it's also the kind of feedback culture you want to create, right? Because in my team, I tell people, please let me know if I suck, if I do something that's not working for you. If you don't tell me, I don't know, right? And coming back to a lot of this behavior is unconscious, right? And I don't think there's evil people. I think there's just ignorance, right? And so to understand that it's coming from a place of ignorance, to have compassion for them, then approach the subject if they're ready for it.
We had a conversation yesterday with Amy Edmondson, the author of the book, The Fearless Organization. And surprisingly so, most, if not all of her answers around how do you actually do this are pretty simple. It's all about being human, as you also say, right? But it is so simple, but it's so hard, right? So, hard in the sense that...
Simple isn't easy, right?
Right. Yeah.
I mean, like we've had, a lot of this stuff, that our teachings and what we teach in workshops is based on, some of that stuff is a couple of thousand years old, right? It's not that it's new. Right, we've known, the very basic thing is, here, you're human, you have a body, you have emotions, you have a mind, you have relationships, you have a voice, you have a vision, you have a capacity to create. Well, activate it and do it. Right? It's about as simple as it can get. Yeah. And to actually do it every day is tremendously hard, right? Because again, we've all, if you think about human as of the hardware, right, and the software, right, the majority of our software was programmed by the time we were 6, right? 80-90% of how we operate, right, was programmed by the time we were 6. It means those are really, really deep things, right? You can do some of it through reconditioning, but for some things you actually need neuroplasticity. You need the actual state of the brain to be open again, so that you can really change deep-rooted experiences, right? And there's a lot of different techniques in that, from breathing techniques to shamanic techniques and all kinds of other ways to create that state of neuroplasticity. But that might be required, right? Because we can't just recondition something that's really, really deeply rooted and ingrained in our neurology. So, but I'm happy to also, as you can say, I love talking about that topic, so happy to, talk plenty more.
Yeah, it's a part of this conversation, of course, is deeply personal. So I also, it's hard to kind of, maybe in this more virtual setting to really go deep. So need for anyone on the line, if you feel the need to dive in or ask clarifying questions, you see Philip's email there. And also
contact info. Yeah, please contact me anytime. I love talking about these things, and always my personal purpose and mission has to do with spreading this. So the more we can, help you spread it in your world, the better. Yeah.
And at the same time, also, if you are interested in how this applies for teams and maybe in your innovation programs, because Philip, that's what you also do. So there might be different angles or levels of questions that you can answer.
Absolutely. And we typically, one of the things that we've actually focused on is to teach some of those capacities in the context of getting work done. Because a lot of times I see leadership programs that are awesome, but they're disconnected from the daily, right? So you have this beautiful weekend or beautiful experience for a few days, and then you come back to life and open your inbox and it's all kind of gone down the drain. Or you have work innovation programs here, like I said earlier, with maybe the best design thinking coaches and stuff, but you're missing the personal piece, and so that goes down the drain too. So we really look at how can we use our daily work because that's your vessel, right? That's your vessel for your, instead of going to a mountain and meditating for 100 years, right? Your vessel of enlightenment is your daily work, right? That's your way of how you can create change. And as the alchemists talk about, turning lead into gold, right? But it really talks about taking the material experience of life and turning it into beauty and wisdom, right? So in a way, your job is your alchemical lab, right? All the conflicts, all the shitty colleagues, all the stupid bosses that don't want to hear something and don't want to even know it and don't want to change their mind and don't want to know that they don't know that they're knowing, all of that's your alchemical material, right? And if you start looking at it that way rather than just you doing your job, then your job can become a vehicle for your own path to enlightenment in some ways.
And it can be playful then as well. So thanks, Philip, for sharing your wisdom with us.
Awesome.
Yeah.
My great pleasure. Thank you.